Today we are going to be talking about Buddhism, and we're going to be particularly talking about Zen Buddhism, especially as it is expressed in the American context. Before we do that, we're going to start wide with Buddhism as a whole and then slowly focus down into Zen Buddhism and Zen Buddhism as we find it here in America. Buddhism itself is one of the major world religions. This graph from 2010 puts it Buddhism as having 7.1 of the global population being its practitioners, putting it fourth for official religions behind Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. I think it is also safe to say that in the last 8 years it probably hasn't changed too terribly much, and if it's done anything, it has probably grown and spread. Buddhism itself was originally founded by a man named Siddhartha Gautama, who lived from 563 to 483 BC. While it's hard to say anything definitively about his life, most legends claim that he was born into a wealthier family in Lumbini, Nepal, which you can see up there on the screen. Lumbini, Nepal, right next to India. He was born there, but after witnessing the poverty and disease among those beneath him, particularly in the lower castes, he went out to seek a better path, a better way of life, and he found his way to enlightenment. His teaching of enlightenment is the recognition of the Four Noble Truths. You can see him there on the screen in simple form, that first, life has inevitable suffering. Second, there's a cause to our suffering. Third, there's an end to our suffering. And fourth, the end to suffering is contained in the Eightfold Path. I'm going to go a little bit deeper onto each one of these points. The first one, life has inevitable suffering, or that all is suffering. The suffering that we all experience is caused by our own desires. We bring it upon ourselves. There are things in life that we want, that we believe will bring us happiness, or security, or comfort. That they will bring us things like money, or power, or fame, or anything else that you believe will give you satisfaction in this lifetime. The problem that we run into time and time again is that none of these things we chase after are actually permanent. Yet we believe that once we attain them, that they will be permanent. So this suffering is the cognitive dissonance that is formed between our desires for permanence, only to learn once we have them that they are quite impermanent and soon fading. This is the first noble truth. The second noble truth tells us of the origination of this suffering. Life was mentioned. Suffering is born out of our innate desire to hold on to something permanent. But this desire catches us in a spiral of existence. It keeps us going through the cycles of death and rebirth, teachings that draw heavily from Hindu teachings of reincarnation. The name of this cycle for Buddhism can be translated as dependent origination. That is to say, who we become in our next cycle of rebirth is dependent on who we were in the life before. Throughout all of our lives, we are all attempting to find this permanence. And since we do not find it and cannot find it, the cycle continues. The third noble truth tells us the way to end this cycle of suffering and rebirth and suffering. The end comes by way of removing from yourself desire. you have to come to a full understanding of the cessation of desire and realize impermanence. Once you realize this fully, then this leads to an end of desire for your eternal self. Your eternal self is the essence that continues throughout all your lifetimes. And once this eternal self has ended this desire for permanence, then you will have become enlightened. Once you are enlightened, your body will still decay and still die, but you do not begin a new cycle of rebirth. Instead, you are brought to nirvana, or emptiness. This is the end of your eternal self's cycle of suffering. The fourth and final noble truth is the Eightfold Path. This is the path that leads us on the way to enlightenment. As you can see on the screen, the Eightfold Path consists of right view, which is to know the truth, right intention, which is to free your mind from evil, right speech, which is to say nothing that hurts others, right action, which is to work for the good of others, right livelihood, which is to respect life, right effort, which is to resist evil, right concentration, which is to practice meditation, and right mindfulness, which is to control your thoughts. As you can see, these are difficult things to all accomplish in one lifetime. And the teaching about it itself assumes that one cannot typically reach enlightenment in simply one lifetime, but instead that it will take many, many lifetimes to eventually ascend to enlightenment. Thus, from this, there are two ways in which a Buddhist will work on their existence. First, they participate in acts of charity and attend temple services. These two things, which can have broad application, usage, and methods, do not themselves lead to enlightenment. Rather, they will hopefully lead to a better rebirth, which can help them work toward enlightenment. So far, this has been a brief overview of Buddhism in general. Now we are going to focus down on Zen Buddhism, as it is found in America. Zen Buddhism is the most popular form of Buddhism that is practiced in America, with about 40% of Buddhist practitioners tracing their roots to Zen in one form or another. Zen itself is part of the broader school of Buddhism known as Mahayana, which means the Great Vehicle. The Great Vehicle is essentially the way in which enlightenment is reached. In Zen, that is meditation. It's also meditation in many other forms of Buddhism, but for Zen it is particular, since the word Zen itself comes from a Chinese word, which is translated directly as meditation. Zen Buddhism also places emphasis on the experience itself rather than any teaching or doctrine. Zen is considered the no text, no doctrine, no external authority type of spirituality. You'll see there is a flower, a lotus flower, on the screen. Legends say that while the beginning of Buddhism began under a tree, which is where Siddhartha first reached enlightenment, Zen began with a flower. The Buddha had at one point assembled some monks on Vulture Peak to give a sermon. But the whole sermon was him simply holding up a flower in front of them. Only one monk understood this sermon, and thus was the beginning of Zen. The idea that he understood was that enlightenment did not rely on intellect or learning in order to be reached. Rather, Enlightenment could be reached only through experiencing it. He also did not give a timeline for enlightenment to take place. Another ancient monk, Master Hasegawa, once said, "It might take 3 minutes, it might take 30 years." The mix of freedom of thought and push against authority and set teachings, as well as the freedom of timeline, seem to sit well into the American mind and context, which may contribute to Zen Buddhism's growing popularity in the United States. But this also makes it difficult to describe exactly what it is that we are talking about when we talk about Zen. What exactly does Zen accomplish within someone's life? Since Zen is primarily a practice and not a philosophy or a religion, then does it do anything? Instead, Zen is described as a path. Neither philosophy nor religion, but a path to enlightenment. So naturally, what then is enlightenment for a Zen Buddhist? You'll remember that for the original Buddha, enlightenment was the breaking of the cycle of suffering. Once you were able to remove desire, you were no longer a slave to this cycle. You could break it and pass into nirvana. For Zen Buddhism, this can look different. And I say can because there are many different schools of Zen Buddhism. So many that it is impossible to cover them all in this short of a time. So we're going to focus on the two major schools of thought that have become popular in America. First, let's begin with the history of Buddhism in America. Buddhism in America came through a couple of different avenues. There are two areas where it really started to accumulate. The first were in the transcendentalist writers in America like Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Walt Whitman. These writers and other transcendentalists acquired access to Buddhist and Hindu texts, as well as other Eastern thought and religions. And while they were not overt in it, these texts had an effect on the transcendentalist writings and the beginning of these Eastern ideas in America. The second thing that really brought Buddhism into view for the American populace was the world's parliament of religions. Buddhism had an opportunity at the parliament to present itself to a sympathetic audience and present itself as a modern religion, which was not what had been previously thought about it by Americans. Buddhism also demonstrated that they could help bridge the growing gap between science and religion, which Christianity was not succeeding at the time. This meeting also provided a jumping-off point, and it was after this that the first Buddhist missions began in America. For Buddhists, though, there were some definite early concerns, like how could the Buddhist teaching of non-self meld with the common idea of American individualism and the importance of the self. Despite these concerns, there was enough popular demand that a Buddhist community began, while small, and in the early years, their main communication was not by meeting, but rather by the sharing of writing, letters, and pamphlets. It still began to take shape, and while it is nowhere near as rigorous in practice in America as it was in the East, and is today in the East, the Buddhist community has continued to grow to this day, and today there are two main schools of thought for Zen Buddhism in America. The first school is Soto Zen. Soto's focus is on meditation alone to reach enlightenment. Soto was mainly originally transmitted by a Japanese monk named Dogen, who is pictured. Dogen was a Japanese monk who became dissatisfied with the way Zen was being taught in Japan and sought a new way, or rather the old way. At that time, Zen meditation was about realizing the true nature of all things, which was called the Buddha nature of an object. The Buddha nature was what one was attempting to attain through meditation. Dogen saw the Buddha nature as something that already existed in complete form within all things, instead of something that needed to be created or a seed that needed to be watered. Thus, for him, meditation was not a path to enlightenment, since the Buddha nature was already complete in all beings, but meditation was an expression of enlightenment. It was not creating something new, but realizing what was already there. For Dogen, this removed notions of the separation between this current existence and nirvana, since to him the Buddha nature encompassed both of these things, and there should not be an unnecessary dualism created between the two of them. So for Dogen, meditation and enlightenment was not a process of becoming, but rather it was becoming. It was not a path to awakening, but it was awakening. Once one could meditate sincerely and completely, everything that was not Buddha nature about a person fell away, and you were left with the pure, shining Buddha nature. So for Soto Zen, this was when you became your truest self and truly understood yourself. And so the study of Buddhism was the study of yourself. The second school is Rinzai Zen. Similar to Soto, Rinzai places a large emphasis on meditation, but to a lesser extent. For along with meditation, Rinzai also focuses on the koan for reaching enlightenment. A koan is a riddle of sorts, which is designed to help break through normal patterns of thinking in order to reach enlightenment. Koans do not have simple, logical, or well-reasoned answers, nor is the answer itself often very significant. Instead, it is about experiencing the koan and the efforts needed to solve it. They are not something that you can find the answer to in a book, or try repeating the answers of others. Rather, it must be pondered contemplatively, and typically the answer will simply jump into the mind, and once you have it, you have reached your first enlightenment. A famous American koan, which you can see on the screen, is this: "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" A humorous example, but yet it accurately represents the type of answer a Buddhist master might be looking for. For when you ask, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" one of the last things that you expect is a slap on the face, except for now that you've read the comment. This type of answer is surprising, and it's also unconventional, and so would have probably been accepted by some Zen masters. Another example of a koan is this: "A man keeps a goose in a bottle. The goose kept growing larger. The man did not want to hurt the goose or break the bottle. How does he get it out?" The koans do not allow for typical answers. In fact, it would seem sometimes the stranger the answer, the more likely it is to be deemed satisfactory, at least from an outsider point of view. There is even one case where a monk answers a koan satisfactory by simply taking off his sandals, putting them on his head, and walking out of the monastery. It is through this abstract thought that enlightenment is believed to be reached. Both of these traditions have things about their methods that are nonsensical or at least difficult to understand for us. But this is also because we come from a Western worldview. To us, logic and reason reign supreme, and all knowledge should bow to it. To Buddhism, as well as most Eastern thought, logic and reason are only one path to knowledge. So the point for them to give these answers that seem crazy or nonsensical is simply to offer a new view or a new perspective that might not have been considered yet. It might be a new way to ultimate knowledge of reality. It also seeks to help us understand that logic does not explain everything or every abstract concept. When we look at something like the concept of happiness, we tend to think of it as a goal in the West. We want to become happy. Zen seeks to show that something like happiness is not a goal, but it's an experience, like the practice of Zen itself. Something that we live through for a time, and then we don't live through for a time. Also, like happiness, Zen and enlightenment are different for everyone, and it's impossible to compare between people. As I mentioned earlier, this is what can be a large draw for people from the American tradition, as well as many others. This idea that each is on their own spiritual journey, but also they have the option to learn from others if they so choose. But ultimately, it is their own journey, and they reach enlightenment by their own means. I'm now going to open up to questions or discussion.